My name is Zaria Brown, and here I will discuss the significance and effects of sound in comics by analyzing the first volume of the acclaimed March Trilogy, a graphic novel that entails the key events of the Civil Rights Movement through the eyes of Congressman John Lewis, by John Lewis, Andrew Aiden, and Nate Powell. To those who are unknowledgeable about comics in general, the idea that they have sound seems obscure. How can there be sound from an inanimate printed image? Well, there isn't. The illusion of sound is created through the use of onomatopoeia and word bubbles, word art, or just the word standing alone. The most commonly known use of sound in comics is through drawn-out exclamations, the stereotypical bam, thud, zoom. But by going deeper into analysis of the implied sound as it relates to the content of the story, it is discovered that the sound often gives a scene a more realistic and lifelike feel that is characteristic of comics and otherwise couldn't be achieved. For example, in this scene, Lewis is at a photo shoot. The sound effects written over the image animate the click and the flash of the camera. As the reader sees the word, their mind mimics the sound it believes would be heard, thereby adding another dimension to the scene. So when I say heard, I mean read and interpreted as. Had the sound not been written in, the scene would be passed over quickly due to it not being fully brought to life. The sound creates a kind of motion. Without the sound, the image is stale. It appears only as a static picture, but in comics, there should be the illusion that the image or panel is fluid with the next, being that they are intended to merge. But what should also be noted is that sometimes absence of sound can be just as effective. For instance, in this scene, Lewis is going on a road trip to the north. The segregated South wouldn't take too kindly to Negroes using their rest stops, so one wrong stop could mean life or death for both of them. The authors make good use of sound, or rather the lack thereof, to encompass the timid mood. Their drive lasts 5 pages of the novel, and there are plenty of objects in the scene that can be given a sound effect. Cars zooming, tires screeching, doors slamming, but there isn't a single inputted sound until they've reached Ohio, where the tension is gone. That silence helps set the cautious tone that the scene aimed to convey because, as I said earlier, an image without a written sound has a particular stiffness, which in this case perfectly captured the mood of the scene. To start the novel, Lewis recalls marching with Dr. King from Montgomery to Selma and being attacked by the local police at the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Rather than explicitly stating the severity of the violence, the authors relied on the effect of perceived sound through seemingly excessive onomatopoeias. The fact that there are so many scattered throughout the scene is representative of all the commotion that happened at the real event. Had there been no sound, the situation would not have been perceived as a chaotic scramble that it was, and hence not dubbed as serious as it was. As the scene ends, the panel zones in on one person, and the scattered noises stop. After the thud when the man hits the ground, everything is suddenly quiet as the officer stands over him. In this case, absence of sound is tremendously effective in helping to create this tense, somber tone right before the man is killed. Building on the layout and frequency of sound, it can be noted that strategic placement, font, and size are key to creating a live comic scene. Sound can travel and have magnitude in comics just as it does in reality. The authors and illustrator of March do this to great effect throughout the story, but the most prominent example is that of the sit-in scene. The diner is intensely quiet as a group of black students sit at the counter waiting to be served. The clicking sound of the waitress's heels appear to travel with her as she walks to the counter because each successive sound is written on her walking path. Also, the delicate font, spelling, and small size of the sound imply that her steps are very light, in contrast to those of the manager, whose steps are conveyed to be heavier and bolder by use of more cacophonous letters and larger font, which is appropriate and intended to convey the authority of the manager in relation to hers, while also contributing to the intensity of the overall tone. Another sound that shows up quite often in this volume is knocking, but each time it is used, the context of the knock is different, so the spelling, font, and size of the written sound are modified. Here, Lewis is in the middle of recalling how he felt writing a letter to Dr. King when he's interrupted by someone knocking on the door. The words knock knock are in thin lettering, but are still bold in the sense that they are in large print and are slanted and accented with thin lines emanating from them. This implies that the knock was sharp and loud. In contrast, the knock illustrated here is in thin font, is of a size that's smaller than the narrative font, has no accents, and has been shorted to N-O-K rather than K-N-O-C-K. This implies that the sound is short and of low volume or magnitude, which is appropriate for this scene because this is when John Lewis is about to meet with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. for the first time. Lewis is extremely nervous about the meeting, and the lack of conviction in his knock on the door is very indicative of that. Moreover, sound in comics isn't limited to an outside-the-bubble structure. The speech is sound, but what is said in a word bubble isn't frequently considered a sound effect, and it shouldn't be in most cases. However, in these cases, the format of the bubble creates a certain texture for the statement it holds that alters the way we would imagine the words and sounds being heard. For instance, a rounded bubble would be heard as someone speaking a relatively normal tone. A thought bubble would imply that there's no sound at all, and a jagged bubble may imply that it's in a loud, bold voice. In March, the word bubbles are untraditional in the sense that they drag and have no formal shape to them and often have lengthy tails. However, I believe that this builds on the effect of the sound of the bubble's content because sound is never really static. It always travels until the sound wave dies down, and that process is hardly ever immediate, as other word bubbles will suggest. The manner that the bubbles in this novel are drawn allows for sound to be heard as intended at a much greater ease to the reader. For example, this scene happens at the beginning of the book while Lewis is getting ready for work. He starts to sing a song, but in some of the word bubbles, the font is gibberish or illegible. This is because the words in the bubble are not as significant as the fact that he's singing. It is the implied sound of his voice, the TV news, and the water from the shower that set the tone for this scene. It is intended to be slow and steady and lighthearted, while also leading the reader into the plot of the novel. It sets the scene, just as sound is intended to do in comics. In the same manner that the abundance of written sound effects on a single page or panel express commotion, a bundle of word bubbles can also express chaos. In this scene, the arrested students are in trial and are refusing bail. Tension and spirits are high, so a chant builds up as shown through the numerous bubbles that have been stuffed into the panel. Chanting is a type of sound in comics, considering that it is more noise than speech, but it is usually written as dialogue because it's being spoken rather than being the audio effect of some action or event. Again, sound in comics can be expressed in many different formats through many variations of size, style, color, spelling, and other factors, but all in all, its primary purpose in comics is to bring the story to life by making them something more than just sequential static images. Sound adds a certain depth and realism to any comic scene that cannot be achieved through many other means, so its significance is undeniable.